So yesterday I put together a quick demo in Angular to showcase how you can walk through the activated routes in the router state tree and gather up all of the parameters that are currently being used. And in response to that post, Danny Blue let me know that there's actually a relatively new setting in Angular that allows a child segment to inherit the parameters from its parent or its descendants, right? Going parent, grandparent, great grandparent, etc. So I had never heard of this feature, so I wanted to quickly explore it. So what I did is I took my demo from yesterday and I went through and I added a couple more IDs. So we have here a primary ID, and then there's a primary detail ID, secondary ID, secondary detail ID, tertiary ID, tertiary detail ID. You can see each one of these has a parent-child relationship. And inside each one of these childs, we're going to output the parameters based on the inheritance strategy of the router. And the inheritance strategy of the router is one of the options you can set here in the router module configuration. And the params inheritance strategy, you can see in this case, is being dynamically driven by a value in the location search string. So the default behavior is empty only, which is what I'm going to use unless the search string starts with $always, in which case I'm going to use the always inheritance strategy, which is what allows the child views to inherit from the parents. Now, to get a quick sense of how this is going to play out, let's take a look at one of the detail pages. This is the primary detail view, but I can assure you that the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary detail views are all basically copy and pasted with the various tokens replaced, primary with secondary, with tertiary, and so on and so forth. And essentially they all work exactly the same way, which is that they insert or they inject the activated route, and then on init they subscribe to the activated route parameters, right? So we get the parameters being injected here into the subscription callback, and then I go ahead and I just log out the primary, the params in the detail view. So the primary, the secondary, the tertiary, they're all going to do this. And then of course in my app component from yesterday's demo, I'm still injecting that router params, which is the service that I created that aggregates all params across the entire router state tree. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to log that out. So we have all router params, and then we have the various detail params. So let's jump into the demo. So here is the demo, and you can see here I have a way to jump from empty only to always. These are the two different strategies. So it's just being driven by the search string there, right? Always empty only. So let's start with empty only, which is the default, and let's go ahead and just navigate to all of our detail pages. So I'll go to primary 101, secondary 202, tertiary 303. Now, if we actually, let's just clear this out and let's refresh the page just so we have a very clear understanding of what's in the console. So the console now contains the params being emitted inside each of the activated routes in the detail pages. So we can see the default behavior for the details is only to include the parameter associated with the current activated route, right? So if we jump back into our module, our router module configuration here, we can see that each of the detail pages only has a single parameter associated with it. The primary detail has the primary detail ID, secondary detail has the secondary detail ID, and the tertiary detail, of course, has the tertiary detail ID. And the default behavior is that each one of those activated routes grants access or direct access only to those without having to traverse the router state tree. Now let's contrast that with jumping over to always, which will just refresh the page in the same view. And now that we're in the always version, we can see that the primary detail view, secondary detail view, and tertiary detail view all have two parameters. Now they have the parameter associated with the local activated route, but they also have the parameter associated with the parent route as well. Primary ID here, secondary ID here, and tertiary ID, right? And we can see, let's just say, for example, here, so the tertiary one, let's go in and actually change this. So here's our tertiary route, right? And it has 3. So now if we go in here and we actually change this from 3 to, let's say, 33 and refresh, we'll now see that the tertiary detail view has a tertiary ID of 33, right, because we're subscribing to the observable, and it has the local value of 303, of course. And of course, the all route parameters, has access to everything, right, because it gathers all the parameters using a different approach, which is to start at the root of the router state tree and then do a depth first traversal of the state tree. Now, a couple things to notice about this is that, well, I don't know if you could actually notice it per se, but essentially the inheritance strategy is linear, meaning that the primary detail view has access to its parameters and its parent parameters, but you can see that it doesn't inherit anything about its sibling views, right? It's not a, the inheritance strategy is not giving it access to all of the routes. It's only giving it access to its ancestral routes, so going up the tree in a linear fashion. You can't see it from the output, but this relationship is also unidirectional, meaning a view has access to its parent parameters, but the parent view is not given any new kind of access to its child parameters. If a parent wants to know what his child is using, it has to navigate through something like the first child or the children collection in the activated route, or of course it could just use some sort of service like this that gathers up all of the parameters across the entire state tree. So again, just to contrast, when we're in the always version of the inheritance strategy, the individual views have access to their own parameters as well as the parent parameters. If we go back to the default behavior, the empty only behavior, the detail views only have access to their local parameters and not to the parameters of their parent or their ancestral views. So I think that's pretty cool. It certainly makes it way trivial to just access parent parameters, which is going to be super helpful when you have a hierarchical view structure in which a child view has to render data or access data, more likely, based on a parent view parameter. So huge thanks to Danny Blue for pointing it out to me, and hopefully this gets now pointed out to others who may not have heard of it either.